I really love iPads. In fact, I own like 7 of them. And if you're potentially looking to buy a new iPad, you probably have realized by now that there are a lot of options. You have the brand new 13-inch iPad Pros with M4 processors and Magic Keyboards and Apple Pencils, and then you have the iPad Air, which just came out, which also has 11-inch and 13-inch, and then you also have the little tiny iPad Mini, and then you have what's just called the iPad 10th generation. There's just a lot of options, and if you've never owned an iPad before, you're probably wondering, where do I even start? I'm gonna hopefully make this video as short and sweet as possible, but I'm not always good at doing that. But hopefully this will be informative and answer the question that a lot of people ask, which is, what iPad should I buy? Now, I think there are 2 types of people. There are people that already have an iPad in a certain capacity, certain size, certain generation, and they're looking for their iPad to potentially do something more than theirs currently does, whether it's a bigger screen, whether it's a faster processor, whether it's better battery life, whether it's larger or smaller, whatever it is, there's usually a reason why someone might be upgrading their iPad. And then there are other people that have never owned an iPad, and they might be thinking, hey, a lot of my friends tell me about how much they love their iPad, and I've been thinking about getting one, but I just don't know which one I should buy. And then there are people that are actually considering buying an iPad as their primary computer, and they're trying to figure out if that even makes sense, or does a computer make more sense. So most likely you fall into one of those 3 categories, and hopefully I'll be able to answer all the questions that make the most sense for everybody. So let's first talk about the different models of iPads that are currently available. As I'm recording this video in May of 2024, the brand new models that just came out are the new iPad Pros with the M4 processor and the iPad Air with the M2 processor. But Apple still also has available just a standard iPad, they call it, just iPad, 10th generation, that has an A14 Bionic chip. And then Apple also still has an iPad Mini available that has an A15 Bionic chip. So we're talking about 4 entirely different models of the iPad, and that's not even counting how many variations inside the models there are in terms of screen size and storage capacity and memory and all that stuff. There's a lot of detail. We'll talk about those things in a second, but first let's just discuss which model is probably right for you. When it comes to any device, whether that's an iPad or a computer, obviously your use case is going to be the biggest factor into which iPad is probably right for you. Depending on how you plan to use your iPad and even how long you plan to keep your iPad really factors in my opinion, which one makes the most sense for you. I think a lot of people that purchase an iPad use an iPad in a very basic form. They want to be able to have a device that's a little bit larger than their phone, and potentially a device that they can watch YouTube on, or Netflix, or maybe have some sort of device that they can watch in their bed that's a little bit bigger than their phone, and they just use it for everyday stuff. Yes, they may start using more apps, they may play some more games, they may do some different things here and there, but for the most part I consider just basic stuff really. The thing that, in all honesty, every single one of these models is going to do just fine. Yes, would you notice a faster processor to open applications and maybe move throughout the iPad on an iPad Pro compared to an iPad Mini or a standard iPad? Yes, you're gonna notice a big difference if you have them side by side. When you're talking about the speed difference between an M4 processor on the new M4 iPad Pro, for example, compared to an A15 Bionic on something like the iPad Mini, absolutely the iPad Pro is going to be significantly faster doing anything you want to do because it has a much faster processor that's available for that. But do you notice it if you're not comparing it side by side? And the answer is no. Even as someone who owns the iPad Pro M4 with a very, very fast processor, lots of memory, lots of RAM, all the stuff that's super impressive on an iPad, I still use the iPad Mini a ton, and I'm just fine with mostly everything that the iPad Mini does because of what I'm using the iPad Mini for. The iPad Pro specifically is really like a computer replacement to me 90% of the time. I've talked about this in other videos before that you can reference if you want to learn more about how I use my iPad, but I use this in its standard configuration with a Magic Keyboard and an Apple Pencil to do a lot of my everyday tasks as a business owner. So that is everything from email to internet to sending quotes for jobs to writing documents to sending proposals, all the stuff that is pretty common. And I like having a nice large screen for that. I like having a keyboard attached, a trackpad. I like using it like a computer. But when I use the iPad mini, my entire purpose of this is drastically different. I am not doing email. I'm not needing to type or have a keyboard attached. I'm not really doing anything other than just, maybe looking at Twitter, or I'm on the internet, or I'm potentially watching YouTube videos in my bed, and I just want to have a nice super small portable iPad that just sits in my lap and I can hold. I sometimes also use this for the remote control for my TV, my Apple TV. All those things I want a nice tiny portable device for. And this way I don't have to always bring my large iPad up to my living room to be able to use it, and I can just have kind of a nice smaller device there for the everyday stuff. I also use this a lot for actually just reading books or reading articles. Being able to have potentially an ebook on here, I think this is a phenomenal device for an ebook or someone that's actually using this as more like an e-reader, because it is easy to just hold in your hands with one hand, no problem, and just be able to use it like a book, because a book isn't much bigger than this on a regular basis compared to, obviously, if you were using the 13-inch iPad Pro and you're using that as an e-reader, it's obviously pretty large. So though it makes a great e-reader because it's large and has a great screen, it's not necessarily portable to just have sitting on your lap. You're really using this, in my opinion, more as your docked device that is more computer-like. So if you're a person that is doing basic stuff like how I use my iPad mini for just web browsing, YouTube, Netflix, different stuff, an e-reader, all that, there is really no reason whatsoever that you need anything more than either the iPad mini or just the iPad standard generation, whatever they call it now, just iPad. Or potentially, if you want a little bit more of an upgrade, an iPad Air, the new 13-inch M2 processor, because they really are going to do all those tasks with no problem whatsoever. The M2 processor in the iPad Air is fast enough to do any task with no problem whatsoever, because even the iPad mini with the A15 Bionic chip, which is the older chip that Apple made, is still plenty fast enough for everything that I mentioned that I do on here. So when you think about it, really try to determine what you plan to do with the iPad. Is this going to be a computer for you, or is this going to be a secondary device that you really just want for media consumption and something that's easier to just have next to you and to grab when you want to do light work and not have to grab your computer? In that case, any of the iPads that are out currently are going to be totally fine for you. Now, there are additional benefits to the different models, the iPad Pro, the iPad Air, the standard iPad, and the iPad mini, things that, depending on what you're going to use the iPad for, could make a big difference. I think the processor, the M4 or the M2 or the A15 Bionic, is not as big of a deal as potentially some of the other things that those models have. For example, the new iPad Pro 13-inch and 11-inch model do have a much better camera than the iPad mini or the iPad Air even. But depending on what you're really using it for, you may not really care. I personally never take photos with my iPad, so I don't care if this had no camera, honestly, on the outside. It wouldn't matter to me because of what I use it for. I use my phone, which has much better cameras than all of them, as my device to take pictures with, or cameras, obviously. One other consideration is camera placement on even the front-facing camera. Now you may say, why does that even matter? Well, depending on if you're someone that constantly uses your iPad for FaceTimes or Zooms or conference calls, whatever it is, that could matter. Now, both the new iPad Pros and iPad Airs have moved the front-facing camera position into landscape mode, which is great. So you are going to be able to have very natural FaceTimes or conference calls or Zooms, whatever, in this natural format, and it's going to look very good when you're actually having that conversation as compared to something like the iPad mini, which has the top-facing front camera. So if you're not holding it vertically like this, you kind of look very odd because you're looking at the person here, but the camera's to the side. But once again, if you're buying the iPad mini, that probably doesn't matter much. Now, one thing that I think is something to consider is that the iPad Pros are the only ones that actually have Face ID rather than just Touch ID. So an iPad mini, for example, as well, you have a Touch ID on the power button. That's kind of what you touch, and that's how it unlocks the iPad, so you don't have to type in your passcode. Whereas the iPad, when it's locked, you basically, similar to what you're probably used to if you have a newer generation iPhone, it just looks at your face and it unlocks. Now that may seem like, oh, that's not that big of a deal, but it is more convenient in my opinion having Face ID because it's just quicker. As soon as you press that power button, being able to unlock it immediately because that Face ID is doing its job is great. I prefer that over the Touch ID because it just is an extra step that I have to do and kind of wait for it to authenticate, but that may not be a big decision for you. The iPad Pro also has things like a LiDAR scanner, which if you're not using it for professional use, that doesn't really matter much, but it is something that only that specific model has, or the iPad Air and anything underneath that do not have that. So also the new iPad Pros and iPad Airs are the only ones that can use the new Apple Pencil Pro. Now, if you have never used an Apple Pencil before, you'd be totally fine probably with all the options that the previous Apple Pencil did. But if you want to take advantage of some of the new gestures and the squeezing and the changing of tools and all that and the barrel roll and all the new things they put in this pencil, you kind of have to get the new iPad Pro or iPad Air because they had to change the camera position. So that meant they had to change the magnet position of how you charge it. So the Apple Pencil Pro is only compatible with the new iPad Pro and iPad Air. So now let's say that you've decided the iPad Pro or the iPad Air. Once again, your use case matters. There is about a $500 difference between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air as we're looking at it in May of 2024. And if you look at the comparisons of what you're basically getting for that, you are getting a little better display, an Ultra Retina XDR display compared to a Liquid Retina display. They both look good in my opinion, and unless you put them side by side, I don't think that would be that big of a deal. You are getting a higher refresh rate on the iPad Pro, but once again, unless you've had that model before, you're probably not really going to realize that. It's not necessarily something I'd say that you should probably buy. I think for the average person that knows what that means, they're going to buy the iPad Pro because they're more of a professional user, and that stuff does matter. I definitely notice the difference between those screens, but I guarantee you if I gave this to my wife and let her compare, she would not say anything about the fact that the refresh rate seemed way faster. She just wouldn't. You have the Face ID on the iPad Pro compared to the iPad Air. I personally do like that better than the Touch ID because it's just faster, but once again, not a huge deal. You have the M4 chip compared to the M2 chip. This is really only gonna matter if you're using very professional applications that require as much RAM as possible. If you are an artist or a video editor or a photo editor or someone that uses some of the iPad apps that are very CPU intensive, it's definitely going to matter to have a faster processor and more RAM, more memory available for you to be able to process those apps. Once again, you'd have to do a side-by-side comparison to probably really see the difference. And if you're not used to the speed of an M4 and you previously have an M1, well, the M2 is still going to feel like an upgrade compared to what you're used to. So you're probably still going to be fine with an iPad Air regardless. But if you previously found that your M1 iPad, for example, was really, really underpowered compared to what you really wanted it to do, then you're going to obviously see an even bigger jump if you go to the M4 in the iPad Pro, because you also have that extra RAM, which does matter for performance. You're going to get the LiDAR scanner on the iPad Pro. I think very few people honestly would care enough for this to matter. If you don't even know what a LiDAR scanner is, then I'm going to tell you right away that you don't need to get the iPad Pro for that. If you're someone that does a lot of work with LiDAR scanner stuff, then you probably are going to want to buy this iPad because that's your only option. But I think that's a very small amount of people. The iPad Pro has an M4 chip up to a 10-core GPU and a 16-core neural engine compared to the iPad Air, which has an M2 chip, a 10-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. So it's really not going to be a drastic difference between these two, as much as Apple will probably tell you that it's 2 times as fast or whatever they're, they obviously always compare and say what the actual spec difference is, but that's if you're actually comparing them side by side. I can almost guarantee you that 99% of people, if you got the iPad Air tomorrow, you're not going to notice that difference. What you might notice a difference with would be things like the camera. The camera is obviously much better on the actual iPad Pro compared to the iPad Air because you have those 2 cameras rather than just one. And that would be something that you probably would notice a lot more. But if you're not using the iPad to take a lot of pictures, then that doesn't matter either. And I don't really think you should be buying an iPad based on how good it takes pictures, because really I don't think you should be the person that's taking pictures with an iPad. One other noticeable difference between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air is you have a 4-speaker audio array on the iPad Pro, as well as 4 microphones, and you have only 2 speakers in landscape mode on the iPad Air and only 2 microphones. Now, you will absolutely notice a difference between the speaker audio compared to the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, but once again, you have to care enough about audio to notice it. And the average person that is listening on an iPad in general or watching stuff on their phone doesn't necessarily notice an audio difference. They might notice a volume difference, but that's not, once again, going to be a big factor to most people. Yes, I'm an audio person that loves audio and I really care about that kind of stuff, but even I didn't buy this iPad because it had better speakers. Most of the time when I'm actually consuming media on my iPad, I'm usually using my AirPods or something else, so I don't really care. The microphones definitely make a difference compared to the 2 microphones in the iPad Air, but once again, if you're just having a FaceTime or a Zoom call, it's not probably going to be that big of a difference that most people are going to know. I highly doubt you're going to hop on a FaceTime and they're going to say, you sound like you're definitely using the iPad Pro with those 4 microphones because it sounds phenomenal. I just don't think it's happening. From a battery perspective, they claim to have the same battery life, up to 10 hours of surfing the web, up to 9 hours of surfing the web on cellular, and that's the same for both iPads. So you're not getting a drastic difference in battery life. Battery life doesn't really matter, 13-inch to 11-inch. And the reason it doesn't matter is because specifically in the new 13-inch, they made the new 13-inch even thinner than the 11-inch, at the sacrifice of not making it have much better battery. They kind of felt like they were okay having the battery life be what it was, which really for the most part is going to be full day battery life. You're not really going to use your iPad for more than 10 hours a day, and even someone like me who uses it a ton still has no problem with the battery lasting most of the day. So does that mean that I'm telling you there's no point in buying the iPad Pro? No, because I do think that depending on the work that you do, if you're using a lot of heavy CPU application stuff like Final Cut or Lightroom or Photoshop, or you're using multiple apps at once, if you're a heavy multitasker on the iPad, you will definitely notice a difference between that M4 processor, but more importantly, that additional RAM. That's gonna matter. But if you are someone that primarily uses one application all the time, and you really don't go back and forth all the time between applications or have them up side by side, I don't think the average person would know. So I do think that the iPad Pro absolutely has a use for someone like me who really doesn't want to have any limitations on the iPad, and I want to be able to use it for any applications that come my way and have no problem with it. That is really just the best option for me, because I like getting the highest end iPad I can because of the fact that I use it all the time. You're going to spend $500 to get a few minor upgrades that you most likely won't notice, when you could take that $500, get the iPad Air 13-inch with a Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil, and still be cheaper than the iPad Pro 13-inch by itself. That also goes for the 11-inch model. You're still talking about a $450 difference between them, and not a drastic difference when it comes to that. Obviously, when you start comparing the iPad Pro to the iPad or the iPad mini, yes, there are significant differences when it comes to a lot of things on them, but you're also talking about a $1,000 difference in price. So you got to choose the one that makes sense for you. The next decision you have to make is what size iPad that you want. Obviously, outside of the processor, one of the biggest things that you're going to have to decide is what size you really want the iPad to be. The iPad mini, though, I think is an amazing device to have because it's very small and easy to just hold in your hand and read, might be too small if you're someone that potentially wants a little bit of a bigger screen. The iPad mini screen is only 8.3 inches, which I think is great for the use that I have for it, and for most people it might be great. But if this is a device that you use a lot and you want to read and you want a bigger screen because maybe your vision isn't as good, or maybe you just think this is too small, then you might want to jump up to the next option, which is an iPad Air, because you then have the option of an 11-inch screen or a 13-inch screen. This being the 13-inch screen size, this is the iPad mini size. Clearly you can see a drastic difference in the size. But then there's one between this that is the 11-inch. This right here is the 11-inch. So we got 13-inch, 11-inch, 8-inch iPad mini. Told you I have a lot of iPads. Now, I personally think that the 11-inch is a phenomenal size for an iPad, in my opinion. This is the iPad Pro, but they also make it 11-inch in the iPad Air, and I really, really like the size of this iPad. It's a great in the middle for me between having a device that's obviously much bigger than your phone, great for media consumption. It's still easy to hold with one hand, but it's still big enough that it feels like a big upgrade from a smaller phone or something that you have that is not necessarily a tablet. And it's really a size that I feel like most people should get for the everyday use. The battery life is really good on it. The ease of use is really nice. If you put a keyboard on it, it doesn't feel ridiculous because the keyboard itself is not going to be tiny like you probably are going to have for something like the iPad mini, for example. But honestly, if you have an iPad mini, you're probably not getting a keyboard for it anyway because you're probably not using it for extensive typing. Where this, if you attach the Magic Keyboard to it or you have some sort of other Bluetooth keyboard, it's still a nice size that you can set down and be able to use kind of like a computer and not feel like the screen is so small that you can't even see it when it's not, right against your face when you're holding it in your hands. So 8-inch here, 11-inch, 13-inch down below. I honestly think that the size of the iPad really should be the biggest determining factor of which one you actually buy. So my summary basically on size is that if this is going to be your everyday computer that you use for most tasks during the day on a regular basis all the time, I recommend going with the largest screen, which is this 13-inch, and getting yourself the Magic Keyboard or another keyboard, but I honestly think this is the best one you can buy because it has the trackpad. And then it really is going to function and feel the most like a computer, which is great if you're doing computer-based tasks. If you're someone that might do some things here and there, but really it's going to be more of a media consumption device, I think that the 11-inch is a really, really great option. Then if you're someone that still is undecided and feels like maybe it would just be better to have a much smaller iPad that is super portable that you can bring with you anywhere and bring with you to a coffee shop and not feel like it's extra bulk. You can just toss this in a purse really easy. You can even put it in some pant pockets because of the size. That's a big factor. This is not going to feel like a lot of weight when you just throw it in your backpack or your purse or something just to have an additional iPad with you. Compared to an 11-inch and a 13-inch is going to feel a little bit larger. You're probably going to need to have something like a computer case or an iPad case besides just your purse or your bag, whatever it is, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's say you've decided on which iPad to buy. You've decided on whether you want cellular or Wi-Fi. You've decided on what screen size that you actually want, and now you have to decide what storage space should I buy for the iPad. Told you, there's lots to discuss. I'm someone that uses my iPad for a ton of stuff, and I have not had anything more than a 512 gig iPad in my history. All the new ones I just bought are all 512 gigs. My previous iPad Pro M1, 512 gigs. I use this for everything, for most of the work that I do, and I still have more than 60% available capacity, including all the applications that I have. I have hundreds of applications on it, but if I look at even this model currently as we speak, you can see that I have 17,000 photos, 127 applications. This is the 512 gig capacity, and I still have 440 gigs available. I think it's important to realize that in this day and age, especially if you have iCloud Drive, which I think most iPhone users, if you're an iPhone user, you probably have iCloud. You're paying for iCloud in some capacity, whether it's 200 gigs or a terabyte. If you have 200 gigs or a terabyte of iCloud Drive space, almost everything these days is cloud-based, so you're not really storing a lot on here. Everything is kind of streaming from the cloud at all times, and you're not really storing additional stuff on here. I feel like the only people that are really, really going to know the difference between capacity are people that don't want to upload everything to the cloud. They don't want to pay that monthly subscription for the cloud, and so they really need everything to be stored here. So that is who I would say to get more capacity to. If you're a person that doesn't pay for a big iCloud storage, so I pay for the 2 terabyte family plan, and we still have a significant amount of space left on that iCloud account. If I go to my account here, we're using 500 gigs of our iCloud out of the 2 terabyte that we can use. And if you see what we're actually using it for, 225 gigs on the iCloud is photos. So if we didn't have iCloud storage, then my iPad is actually over 500 gigs, and this 512 gig would not be enough. But we're paying for that iCloud storage, the 2 terabytes. We still have tons of space left, 1.5 terabytes still available, and the iPad is barely using anything because we aren't downloading a lot of stuff to it. Now, if you're someone that doesn't have iCloud storage and you take a ton of video, if you take a ton of photos and you want everything to live locally so it processes faster and you're able to edit this stuff, that obviously could play a factor for you. I found that I've never really once had a capacity issue, and I use the iPad extensively. The only other time that you're really going to be downloading stuff that's not on the cloud is if you download a ton of videos from your own library or from something like Netflix or YouTube, and you download things for offline use, right? It's the idea that I'm going to go on a plane and I want to be able to watch these movies or watch these YouTube videos, and I am not going to have internet to be able to download from the cloud. So you store things locally. But even that feels like it's a temporary thing. You could download a ton of videos if you wanted to go on a plane and not use up that much space, and then just delete them when you're done and you're going to get your space back. So I don't think it's a huge issue. But if you're a pro user who's actually editing tons of photos and you need them to be stored on the local iPad because you want them in full raw quality, you will notice that space more. You will absolutely take up a lot more space in something like Lightroom when you're talking about raw images, thousands and thousands of them if you're editing in real time. So when you see capacities like 1 terabyte and 2 terabytes available for a person buying an iPad, I really think that that's a very small niche, and I think that they charge a lot of money for that niche, because if you actually look at the comparison in price, a 256 gig model starts at $1299, and it's $1,000 difference to get 2 terabytes compared to 256. Apple makes a ton of money on storage that they really should make a little bit better, in my opinion, because it seems a little absurd that it's that cost. But I think it's crazy for most people to get more than 512 gigs. I do think you should go above 256. I feel like 512 is a good sweet spot because 256 gets taken up a decent amount just for the actual software, the stuff in general, and a processor. A hard drive is always going to work better when you are not using close to the max capacity. They always say you should have at least 10 to 15% of your available hard drive for it to continuously work as good as possible. So I do think that that is a good starting point. I think it's worth the extra $200 to get the 512 gig. But don't even consider the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte option unless you are one of those niche people who is doing tons of editing on their own local files, whether it be video or photo. Now, one suggestion I would personally make after using the iPads a ton is to choose the cellular option on the iPad and not just the Wi-Fi. Yes, that's going to come with an additional monthly charge on your cell phone bill. But in my opinion, what makes the iPad so convenient, what I love so much about using the iPad, is that instant always-on connection that exists by having cellular. Yes, anywhere you go now has Wi-Fi, and I get that. But anywhere you go, you always have to choose and select the Wi-Fi that's nearby. Most of the time, it's going to make you log in of some capacity, or it's going to make you type in your email and basically give them the information for you so that they can spam you with additional sales things. It still is a process. Though Wi-Fi is free at a lot of places, most Wi-Fi still enables another step. That may not be a huge deal to you, but I personally have found that the Wi-Fi in most places is also just very slow compared to how fast the LTE and cellular on these devices actually is. The 5G and the LTEs on all the networks now is just so much faster than the standard Wi-Fi you're going to find, and it's also just not shared and slowed down in that local place that you're actually using it. If there's a bunch of people on a slow Wi-Fi, for example, it really slows down the speeds. I personally never connect to Wi-Fi when I'm anywhere with my iPad. I just use the cellular, and I just find it more convenient because whether I go from my car to the coffee shop to the airport to a friend's house to wherever I want to go, the beach, anywhere, I just have my connection and I can always use it. Now, yes, you could hotspot your phone instead, and that's an option, but an option to consider that if you're hotspotting your phone and using the iPad with that hotspot for hours and hours on end, you're going to have to worry about your battery life decreasing on your phone, and then you're having to worry about charging. And so that's something to keep in mind. Though you can hotspot your phone, it still is a little bit less convenient than just having the iPad do its job and always be connected. So whether you buy the iPad Pro, the iPad Air, the iPad Mini, the other iPad, they all have cellular option. I think it's worth having that option. I also think from a resale standpoint, it's actually good as well, because I feel like more and more people are going to the cellular options, in my opinion. And if you are reselling your iPad at any given point, I tend to think that more people will look for the cellular option, because you don't have to connect cellular, and you can just choose to use it as Wi-Fi only and not pay that additional fee. But you can't add cellular to a Wi-Fi only iPad option. So the resale value might be a little better on the cellular options, though you do spend a few more dollars to buy that option in the first place. So does it even out? Who knows? Now, if you are using the iPad as your everyday computer, I think the cellular is a no-brainer, because honestly, you will find that it is so much more convenient being able to just pull this out in a car, anywhere you are, instantly connect, do your thing, emails, browse the internet, whatever, go back and forth, and not have to worry about, am I out of range? Or if you just spend a lot of time even in your backyard or somewhere where there's not necessarily going to be strong Wi-Fi, that cellular option to me is a no-brainer. I would absolutely recommend it. It's one of my favorite features of the iPad personally, and why I use it as my everyday computer. I just really think it's great. So those are really the options when it comes to the iPad. Which model do you want? Which size screen do you want? Which capacity do you want? And do you want cellular or do you want Wi-Fi only? That was kind of my thoughts. Hopefully this helped answer a lot of random questions. I have extensive use with an iPad, and I've used them for many years on a lot of different stuff. It's my everyday computer. So I feel like I have a lot of experience into what matters and what doesn't, but you have to decide for yourself, obviously, what matters to you. I am not paid by Apple in any way, and all the iPads that I have purchased with my own money. Apple has never sent me a single product. I really wish they would, because I spend way too much money on their products. But I've been able to buy a lot of them and test a lot of them out and use a lot of them, and I have lots of thoughts, as you can see from them. So no matter which iPad you buy, I really think the iPad is a phenomenal tool that lets you be more productive if you are someone that uses it in the way that I do, or it just allows you to have a really nice media consumption device that is much better than your phone, but yet smaller than a TV. It's nice and portable. It's a great e-reader. It can do a lot of things, and it's only going to get better and better as the software improves. So I hope this video was helpful. Consider subscribing if you never have, because I'm going to post a lot more iPad content as someone who uses it a lot. I already have a bunch of videos on the iPad and would love to answer any questions for you. My stomach is rumbling. I'm hungry. So let's end it right there.